This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. History. What a miserable pile of secrets. What good has come out of it? The present? Don't be absurd. And what's next? The future. God help us. I've been doing YouTube now for a few years, and I've noticed that when people don't label me as the trans channel, people usually label me as a history channel, which is fine as long as it's not the history channel. But I don't really consider myself doing history-focused content, now do I? I don't really talk that much about history, even if it's a significant part of what I do. Labels, huh? Who needs them? I mean, after all, I'm just Mia Mulder. The first. And as a Mia Mulder, I feel I should comment on how we, as a commune of intellectuals, deal with the past. And so I will at last live up to that unworthy label that the internet intelligentsia has placed upon me, and at last deal with that fickle beast of history. But why, oh why, must we suffer the product of the wasted academic efforts of this dramatis persona? We can all read Wikipedia these days. History's in the past. No one cares. We don't need historians anymore. We have the media and Twitter. I mean, history is irrelevant anyway, as the best Star Wars movie has told us. Let the past die. Ew. So let's talk about history. Oh, and like Vikings and Nazis and stuff. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I have a pretty complicated relationship with history. History is something that is taught basically all over the world as part of a basic education package. It's seen as kind of a universal knowledge thing. It's pretty much expected that everyone around the world should have a basic understanding of history, on the same level that people should have a basic understanding of geography, math, biology. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And stuff like that. It surprises me though how different high school level history and university level history actually are. I remember from my own high school education that most history we studied was stuff like wars, unifications, some revolutions, like the big stuff that people think are cool, usually involving lots of guns. But in academia, it's almost none of that stuff. I mean, there's always going to be the weird people who really are into one specific certain subject, but most studies center around how history is, rather than specific events. A common misunderstanding about history is that historians memorize dates and wars in the name of kings and presidents. And while there are definitely people who do that, that's not really what history is. History is the study of the past, but the study of the past is everything that has happened in human history that people have written down, which is a lot to remember if you have to do it that way. There is an important distinction though between the past and history. The past is simply every single historical event that has happened, but history is kind of like forming a narrative around that past that is easy to digest and understand for people in the present, whatever that is. The task of historians then is to take past events and weave them into a narrative and place them into context. And that context is critical. The problem though is, as I mentioned, that the past is everything that has ever happened in human history. So you can kind of pick and choose whatever context you want. And while most historians do this pretty well, there will always be the weird people who have a very weird context for their historical narratives. And I'll get back to them in a little bit. The crux is context. The job of an historian isn't that easy though, because while people did write down a lot of what they did in the past, they didn't write down everything. So there are always gaps in our historical knowledge, which means that sometimes we kind of have to just guess, or at least try to make an educated guess about what is actually going on or how people lived. But obviously you can't just assume things out of nothing unless there is contextual precedent for it. However, another task of historians is to try to figure out causes and effects of certain historical events, which sometimes can be hard to do and sometimes is bleedingly obvious. Like maybe being appeasing to an ideology that is inherently expansionistic maybe wasn't the best idea, Neville Chamberlain. Like, I'm just saying, a lot of historians aren't on your specific side on that one. So the job of an historian is twofold: to put past events into a narrative that makes sense, but also to make sense of that narrative. And obviously you should be able to support this with evidence, if you can. Although if you can't get your own evidence, store-bought theory is fine. It's also important to mention that for most of history's history, it was mostly treated as an art more than a science. As in, how can you use the events of the past to paint a beautiful picture? How do you construct the best narrative? And that is why much of history is written around great men or great empires, because they make interesting stories, but they're not very scientific about why those things happened in the first place. It's more interesting to ask, what is this story about this runestone, rather than talking about development of agricultural techniques. So with all of that in mind, let's talk about making America great again.
America safe again. And yes, together we will make America great again.
The slogan "Make America Great Again" is very famously connected with Donald Trump, but it was also used by Ronald Reagan and what's his name? Oh my god, I forgot his name. What's Clinton's first name? Not Hillary. The other one. Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton used it too. Make America Great Again is a very good slogan, because at the same time it can refer to basically whatever you personally want. Let's make America great again. What does that mean? What is again? It obviously refers to the goal of making the current America into something that it used to be. But what did it used to be like? And I should say, this kind of applies to any kind of variation on the term, such as, let's make America reasonable again. When was it ever reasonable? The term allows people to construct their own historical narrative around the term, but then connect it to a specific politician, whoever that may be, whether it be Ronald Reagan, or Bill Clinton, or Donald Trump, or anyone really. And in that sense, it's a very good slogan, because you can just tell people that, like, hey, the thing that you liked about America that isn't around anymore, you can have that again. And I'm gonna make it happen. So for people who are extremely racist, they think, oh cool, he wants to make America like back when it was super duper racist. I mean, it's still super duper racist, but I mean, there are levels here. Meanwhile, people who claim to not be super duper racist, but instead want to focus on American pride and economic superiority, whatever that means, they think that it just refers to the economic aspect of American manufacturing or whatever. And because no one is specific about what it actually means to make America great again, this kind of keeps on working. For this video though, I don't actually care that much about any specific politician making use of the phrase. I'm referring more generally to the use of historical context, in this case where politicians passively allow an audience to construct their own historical narrative. But that has consequences in the long run when you eventually have to construct your own historical narrative. Philosopher Stefan Molyneux is a sort of expert in this field. He does this all the time, and he uses his credentials as a historian to back these up. On his YouTube channel, he has talked about the fall of the Roman Empire somehow being the fault of the welfare state of Rome? Or he'll accuse historians of fabricating history so that white people will feel guilty. And he's also like a massive racist. While a lot of people simply do weird history to support their own political beliefs, some let that history influence their entire personality. So let's talk about that. If you've ever been on Twitter or on any sort of website where people can talk freely, you probably notice a lot of people who are very extreme in their politics, one way or the other. What I mean is, there will always be those accounts that have a knight or a World War II soldier, or maybe some sort of tank, perhaps someone with a hat like this. And of course I have to mention the prime example of this, which is this guy. Oh my god, I can't believe I share a country with this guy. He constantly portrays himself in various historical attire, talks about Viking mentality, and he also sells nutrition that's named after the bad guys in Nordic mythology. Marcus, the Jotuns were the bad guys. What are you doing? You're fucking up even this! It's very easy to spot when you're talking about people like this. Like, it doesn't actually matter, right? Like, these people are obviously on the deep fringe and no one actually cares what they say. But the thing is, they are only the most extreme cases of a far more common phenomenon. A phenomenon of the history fetish. And like, I get it. I also want to fuck history. History fetishists are very easy to spot when you're talking about people who are basically cosplaying as their favorite historical characters. But I think it's kind of important to talk about how it manifests in less extreme cases. Not too long ago, there was a discussion in Sweden, for example, talking about banning the runes. And many people on the nationalist right were very upset about this, including the lad we talked about earlier. And the thing is, it wasn't even going to happen. It was only a mild suggestion against specific runes used specifically in cases of hate speech, because they wanted to specifically crack down on specifically one neo-Nazi movement. Which is fine, actually, because, hot take, fuck Nazis. This only happened because a lot of people so deeply identify themselves with the concept of specific runes. Which is kind of weird, because runes are just letters that no one really uses anymore. But they had constructed this historical narrative that they identified so deeply with that even the mere suggestion of maybe restricting the use of a rune by use of neo-Nazis would be so detrimental to all of Swedish culture. Presumably because they identify much more with their historical narrative of what Swedish culture should be, rather than actually go out and experience what Sweden is actually like. But the thing is, it doesn't just happen on the right. This thing can happen on the left too, and even among centrist circles. So while a lot of far-right people kind of worship the sort of manhood-centric cultures of the far past to build their nationalist ideas upon, there are also a lot of leftist history fetishism about international workers' movements or communes or other leftist communities that have happened in history. And you may think this is just fun and games. Looking back to history is nice, right? But remember what I said in the beginning, that history is different from past events. And while it's fine to talk about past events, you kind of have to learn about them for history to actually be useful. To draw historical knowledge is to actually draw conclusions from history that is accurately put into context. And while that sounds obvious, a lot of people make the mistake anyway. And it's kind of absurd when you think about it, because no one else would do that in almost any other field. I mean, I know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. But that doesn't really mean that I know anything about biology. A common example that I find interesting is the Paris Commune, which, in my opinion, is only really remembered because it was remembered by Daddy Left. The Paris Commune was a socialist or anarchist or communist or whatever you want to call it, revolutionary government that kind of took over the entire city of Paris between the 18th of March and the 28th of May in 1871. This is because the Second French Empire had completely collapsed after a war with the Prussians, and people in Paris were like, "No, we don't want to do that no more. We don't want to fight. We just want to vibe, you know. We just want to chill. We just want to have like a commune, you know." The commune inspired a lot of philosophers who drew a lot of philosophical inspiration from how the commune was run, which there is conflicting ideas about how that was done. And while the Paris Commune was no doubt historically important, almost no one I have met ever talks about it in its proper historical context. For example, communists will claim it as a communist victory. Je suis un communiste. And I've met anarchists who claim it as an anarchist victory. Je suis un anarchiste. While in actuality, it wasn't a victory at all, because it didn't last. And while it is entirely valid to blame the downfall of the commune on the French military destroying it, the damn French nerds, we can't really attribute any victories to the commune either, simply because the commune lasted for like 8 weeks. I've had camps that last longer than that. However, I want to make clear, that doesn't mean that the ideas implemented in the Paris Commune are necessarily wrong. It just means that the lessons that people draw from the Paris Commune might not be as relevant today as people think that they are. Partly because it didn't really last very long, and secondly because the context around the formation of the Commune in the first place would be very difficult to replicate today. Like, we, and Karl Marx, can praise the Paris Commune as much as we want, but neither the leaders of the Commune or Karl Marx really predicted the use of like smartphones and facial recognition technology, things that could potentially change the context around any sort of revolution today. My point here is that it's entirely okay to talk about past historical events, but it's important to view them in the context of their time, but also to actually put them in the context that they belong. At a certain point, we also have to accept that the past is the past, and we have to let the past die. I love you. I love you. But let's talk about romance. For the last 200 years or so, there's been a sort of fascination with Vikings and Old Norse mythology. And I think it would be interesting to talk about why that is. Like, why do so many Nazis use runes? Why is Nordic paganism overrepresented in terms of like Nazi mythology? Isn't that weird? Sweden, my motherland, used to be one of the European great powers and used to just kick ass all over Europe. But then some things happened, lost half the empire, had a bit of a national identity crisis, as you do. And during this time there was a big national crisis of identity. Who are we as a nation? If we can't be a great power anymore, what are we even? Are we even powerful anymore? How can we be strong on the world stage? And what a lot of Swedish historians did was dig into the old Viking legends. This is called the national romance, where people romanticize the idea of the nation. And in the Swedish case, this involved a lot of Vikings, because Vikings were partly Swedish. And during this time, and the decades and centuries after it, a sort of legend around Vikings was created. And it's important to say here that it was created, because it's not necessarily based in actual historical fact. For example, we do know that Vikings did a lot of raiding and migrating and sailing, but we don't really know that much about their culture or religion or much of anything really, because they didn't really write stuff down. In many ways, Old Norse culture is kind of prehistoric, because they did have a runic system, but it wasn't really used for like actual documentation of things. And for a long time people didn't fully understand what they actually meant. And so legends were built around these runes as well. Here's a runestone that I have very close to my house. And this is where the myth was created that Vikings were tall, blonde, beautiful, honor-bound warriors, powered by religious fervor. Well, the truth is they were most likely powered by wanting to live where the farmland is better. I'm not sure you've been to Scandinavia, but it's cold here. The soil ain't good, and so people wanted to leave. But that's not really cool. Like, it's not really something that you want to be proud of as a nation. Instead, you create the myth of like a strong Nordic soldier, warrior, someone to inspire the people, which is kind of funny when you think about the actual reality of how the Vikings actually were. Let's translate that runestone I just showed you.
Vigmundr had the stone cut in memory of himself, the most skillful of men. May God help Vigmundr, the captain's soul.
It's just like a guy bragging about himself, but it's not really the legendary glory-seeking people that we thought that they were. And that's kind of where the myth has remained. And so amongst nationalists, this idea of Vikings has also remained. Fascist Italy looked to the Romans, for example. A lot of nationalistic Britons used Arthurian legend. The Austrians what did the Austrians use? Probably not that, but can you imagine in like 1825 and the Austrians are going to war, and the first thing that their enemy can hear when the Austrian army advances across the field, and it's just like... But the thing is, that national romance didn't just stay in the past, which is one of the biggest misconceptions about history. There's this idea that the present is very different from the past, or somehow disconnected, but that's not really true. In terms of the national romance, that's still around. In any conversation about what it means to be a nation, that's what that is. When people are talking about what it means to be American, they are doing a sort of national romanticism, which is not in itself a bad thing, but it does misuse a lot of history. But it also shows itself in basically every single nation's history education. And that kind of happens by default because most nations will teach about their own history, and the history of their own nation is usually something that is very favorable to their own nation. For example, I was raised in Sweden, so basically everything I had in Swedish high school was the Swedish Empire and Swedish conquests and Carolus Rex and conquests in Poland and all sorts of shit. Like, that isn't that accurate to what like history is. A lot of people use the phrase history is written by the victors, which is terribly misunderstood because it kind of gives the impression that like whoever wins a conflict will write the history of it, which is not how it works. History is written by the victors means us, the people who are still here, the people who won, the nations who won, because there are more nations and more peoples in the history of the world than currently exist right now, simply because things have happened during history. And so history can often become a tool to reinforce nationalistic ideas. The thing is, a lot of people use history to construct their own national identity, even if it's not necessarily accurate to what it actually was like. Like, some people will picture the French Revolution and imagine themselves as being the embodiment of liberty and destruction of the old order, while in actuality they would more likely be like this. Jag är så jävla fattig. When it comes to history, context is everything. And the problem is that context is very hard to root out. And the thing is, anyone can create an historical narrative if they want to. All you need to do is go to Wikipedia, read some past events, and then come up with your own theory as to why the things happened the way they did, and why things look the way they do today. I mean, it will probably be wrong, but you can do it. And this is what everyone does. I mean, it's not necessarily bad in itself, but it's not productive either. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And it's important that we actually learn from that history and not just behold it, because that is not the same thing. Well, that sure was something. I'm shooting this before I shoot the rest of the video, so I have no idea what's actually in it. But history sure is a fickle beast, is it not? Have some water, you need it. You desperate. Ah, no, I'm spilling! No! Wine glasses aren't the best for watering plants. As we've seen, history seems to be the knife of ideology. A powerful tool, but dangerous in the wrong hands. Powerful as a tool, but dangerous in the wrong hands. Or, more realistically, it's an academic subject with almost no practical value in the private sector. It doesn't pay well, is what I'm saying. Which is partly why this video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is the service that has thousands of titles about documentaries and history, and if you're a history fan like me, you'll definitely find something you like here. If you go to curiositystream.com/MiaMulder, you also get access to the streaming service Nebula. You get Nebula bundled with CuriosityStream for as long as you use it, and you can get a whole year's subscription for only $19.99. It's like 20 bucks. Okay, that was fun. Bye! Thank you for watching that video. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, and maybe hitting the bell because it really helps the channel. If you'd like to support my work financially, you can also go to patreon.com/MiaMulder and get a bunch of extra stuff like deleted scenes and bloopers and all that sort of cool stuff. I'd like to give special thanks to Aini Salminen, Alicia Crawford, Amalia, Amanda B, Athiet, Austin K, Autumn, Catherine Stenson, Christine Gutierrez, Cobra Sphere, Dana Ferguson, Divine Yuri, Emil Rutkowski, Emily Rains, Emma Not Goldman, Fox Kant, Jane Lusby, Janelle Torgesson, Jonathan Wardrell, Josie Volps, Jörgen Danielsen, Kitchens, LPQ Silver, Linus 2.0, Michelle, Ms. Miser, Morimer, Mountain Snow, MSG, Nairopsaka, Nork 426, Patrick Stack, Phobos 2390, Riley Knox, Safi Huck, Scary Sun, Zitzrees, Thoros of Mir, Tiffany A, Thoros of Mir, Travis, Tulip, William Fuhustle, Uncle Cheese, Rosie, Vinder, Vivian Crow, and Wolfgang, the Grand High Exalted Wizard.